I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild Audio Podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it.
As artificial intelligence rapidly transforms media, journalists and conservationists are confronting a new and unsettling reality. What happens when we can no longer trust what we see in nature documentaries and wildlife photography? WCS's Hannah Kaplan spoke with Rhett Butler, founder and CEO of Mongabay, about how AI-generated wildlife imagery is beginning to reshape conservation journalism and why the stakes may be much higher than they first appear.
Last year, reports began swirling online of a lioness supposedly sighted in Djibouti, in Eastern Africa. The video spread quickly across Facebook, WhatsApp, and TikTok. The problem? There are no lions in Djibouti. By the time fact-checkers and conservationists responded, the clip had already reached a wide audience, adding to growing concerns about how AI-generated, misleading wildlife content can undermine trust in conservation storytelling.
I would say I'm increasingly concerned, and the issue isn't just AI creating fake images, it's that it's creating convincing ones that are being done at scale, and often by people who have no connection to wildlife.
For more than 25 years, Mongabay has led the way in environmental and conservation reporting, with founder Rhett Butler witnessing firsthand how the digital landscape has reshaped the industry. For Butler, the danger of AI isn't simply fake content. It's a combination of realism and how quickly this type of content can be amplified. Wildlife images have always carried an implicit promise. This actually happened. Now, that assumption is collapsing.
Just generally, we are encountering more and more images and videos that are seemingly generated or substantially enhanced. And these are even showing up in the photo libraries that we've traditionally trusted. And so these platforms tend to defend these images all as real, but we're having to make these judgment calls now in the newsroom about whether to use them. For us, camera trap imagery historically has also been pretty popular, but it's no longer reliable because it can easily be generated. It's lower quality, but it opens the door for all sorts of crazy fabrication.
And in conservation, trust matters. Images and videos shape how people perceive wildlife. When AI-generated clips show attacks or dangerous encounters that never happened, they can fuel fear.
And so these sorts of false attack videos can inflame people's anxiety in places where you already have human-wildlife conflict and just make it harder to actually help protect and coexist with these animals.
In other cases, the distortion is softer. Sentimentalized wildlife behaving like pets, or fabricated interactions that encourage the exotic pet trait.
Back in the early days before AI was widespread, it would be, cute baby tiger videos or slow lurse or whatever that kind of fed that trait. But now that you can make those animals extra cuddly, or animals are even, crazier to keep as pets in circumstances where, they're being represented as pets.
Conservation newsrooms themselves are working quickly to adapt. Butler describes a recent incident involving a scientific paper about cobras appearing on trains and train stations in India. The paper was peer-reviewed and was from trustworthy sources. The images passed AI detection tools, but something felt off.
And so we reached out to those authors who said that the image had been verified and that it had come from a trustworthy source they'd worked with before, and they'd run it through AI checkers, which it passed. We had our doubts, but it was in a scientific journal that was peer-reviewed. And so we went ahead and used the image. It is an illustration of what the paper was about. That said, once it was published, there was quite a strong backlash from the research community about this image. And so we jumped into it and really dug into it and basically found more evidence that strengthened our conviction that it was a generated image.
That means conservation journalists and NGOs are now spending more time and money verifying content that once would have been taken at face value. And ironically, truly extraordinary wildlife footage may now be treated with skepticism, precisely because AI can imitate it so well.
You have to respond to these events that may have never occurred, and so that requires resources. Whether those are NGO resources or state resources. There's not enough resources in this space already, so this is a real issue. And then I think even a bigger issue is the erosion of trust, which is really what conservation depends on to be effective. I think the result of all this is that genuine evidence risks being met with skepticism, especially when it's something, truly unusual being observed. And so that just increases the burden of showing the evidence is real. So that increases the cost, whether you're an NGO or a journalist.
The value, then, increasingly lies in the trustworthiness of the platform and the journalistic rigor behind the reporting, relying on established networks of trusted photographers, videographers, and journalists to verify content as thoroughly as possible.
I mean, it's tricky. It's really about sourcing, right? So, if you're sourcing stuff off Facebook, then you have zero confidence that it's a real image unless you know the photographer personally. So you have to sort of like go do that level of due diligence where you can trust that source. So a lot of it is around relationships. So working with photographers you trust or institutions you trust is a critical aspect of it. And unfortunately, like a lot of it just boils down to editorial judgment. So I mean, in terms of a producer, like this is what it is. But I mean, if you're a consumer at the end, then you have to rely on sort of editors and people who are producing the content that they went through some sort of due diligence process.
At Mongabay, teams are using a mix of reverse image searches, metadata checks, forensic tools, and trusted source networks to verify content. But Butler says identifying AI-generated media is still very much a learning process, with no foolproof system for catching every fake.
There is no silver bullet. So having multiple images to verify something rather than just a one-off, looking at metadata of the image, which again is like very spotty because a lot of images don't have metadata unless you get the original, and people often don't have the original. Using things like, reverse image search and some other forensic tools. We found that AI checkers don't work. I mean, like they give you false positives or false negatives. So like you can try those things. And I mean, if like 15 all say it's fake, then, it's probably fake or generated, but there's not like one tool we find that's foolproof.
But Butler is careful not to frame AI itself as the enemy. In conservation science, AI is already helping researchers process enormous amounts of camera trap imagery, satellite data, and bioacoustic recordings. The distinction, he says, is between interpreting reality and fabricating it.
So I think that can all be very beneficial, that there are ways to use AI that can help conservation as well. The harmful side is really when AI fabricates events or presents synthetic things as being real. I think a key question is whether the audience is being clearly told whether this is real or generated, and whether you're trying to represent something as an observed event or a constructed one.
In a world increasingly flooded with generative media, conservation storytelling may be entering a new era, one where authenticity itself becomes one of the most valuable forms of evidence, and perhaps one of the hardest things to protect.
This is fundamentally about trust. So conservation is really dependent on a shared understanding of reality. What species exist, how they behave, what risks they face. And so at the end of the day, that's one of the biggest concerns around AI generated content is whether this is real and you can maintain that trust.
For WCS Wild Audio, I'm Hannah Kaplan.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Hannah Kaplan, with help from Dan Rosen and Nat Moss. The WCS Wild Audio podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Stay tuned for our next episode, and don't forget to rate, follow, or review the show wherever you get your podcasts.